Okay, I am going to do speaker and also you can let me worry about letting people in while you then do the introductions. That way you can focus. Let
Okay,
me.
we are
Uh,
live.
uh, yep.
We are now live. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Slavery Archive Book Club. We are here back for the fall sessions. And today we are here to discuss this very nice book, edited book by Lissette Acosta Corniel, that is Transatlantic Bondage, Slavery and Freedom in Spain. Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico. And this is a book that was published with SUNY Press in 2024. We have the hardcover edition, but the book is already published also on paperback. And this is a book that Lissette, she edited, but we have, of course, then several contributors in this book. And several of them, they are here with us. So I will just say who they are first, then just to tell then who Lissette is, because this is then one of the most important things we have, because Lissette, she has been the leader of this project since the beginning. Then Lissette, she is an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic and Race Studies at the Bureau of Manhattan Community College at CUNY. And she writes about gender, race, and slavery in colonial Hispaniola. And she has several articles published in different journals in then Spanish and also in English, then Estudios Sociales, Perspectivas Afro, and Human, Gender, and Families of Color. And an important element to remind here that she has been the associate researcher for the database First Blacks in the Americas, then that to some extent is at the origin of a lot of what we are going to discuss here today. Before going further, let me just call Alex Gill, that is our co-host, that then we co-host this book club together. Then me and Alex will be then taking the questions and making the introductions. But the other contributors to the book, some of them are here. Then Jorge Chinea, then is one of them. And then after we are going to go over each chapter and author by these different authors. Jacqueline Jimenez Polanco. We also have a chapter by Aurelia Martin Cáceres. And Aurelia, I don't think that she is here today. Then we have Rocio Piranhas Gomez. We have David Starks. And then we have Anthony Stevens Acevedo, who I think is here with us. And we have Richard Lee Tourist, who is also here with us. So we are going to have an introduction by Lissette. Also, each author will talk a little bit about their chapters, those who are here, and then we are going to open for questions that you can ask with your video on. You can put them in the chat. And if you are watching on YouTube, perhaps we can try to get questions from YouTube, depending on how busy things are there. Thank you so much. Lissette, you can go.
Oh, thank you. I was waiting for the cue. Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy to see some familiar names and faces, and also to see so many that I did not know before. Very happy to meet you at the Slavery Archive Book Club. Thank you, Anna and Alex, for having all of us. Transatlantic Bondage, it's part of the Latinx Future Series with SUNY Press. As Anna mentioned, came out in 2024. And I'm very grateful to series editor Vanessa K. Valdez, and also acquisition editor Rebecca Colesworthy, and the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute for their support. And I cannot fathom like to just keep going without thanking my fellow colleague contributors for their patience and their insights and their collegiality, because this is a project that started in 2015. And as Anna mentioned, some of the collaborators are here, others are not. What I'm going to do is provide a very brief summary of the introduction, and then give you also a very short story of the chapters from the contributors who are not here. And we'll move forward with the collaborators who will continue the conversation with us today. The book, Transatlantic Bondage, has 8 chapters, 2 on slavery in Spain, 4 on slavery in Santo Domingo intentionally, and 2 on slavery in Puerto Rico. I'm going to time myself to 15 minutes. That way I stick to my notes and I respect your time and my colleagues' time as well. Now, in my opinion, I think that the book is well-rounded and a good source for undergraduate studies, given that it provides an introduction to several topics on slavery on the regions that I discussed. And it is also a good source for graduate studies for those who want to ask the hard questions and also build on the work that the book addresses. It includes historical background, laws, slave trafficking, cultural norms, gender, and my favorite part, micro stories, which is one of the essences that we're missing about slavery in Santo Domingo specifically. It was important to include slavery in Spain in this project because the Spanish royal crown was as responsible as the Portuguese for spearheading the enslavement of Black Africans and the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas. Yet, whether ironic or not, similar to the Dominican Republic today, slavery in Spain does not exist in the collective or public memory, as it does, for example, in France, Great Britain, and the United States. Therefore, starting from the foundation and then moving to the development was intentional, especially because my first goal was always to present Santo Domingo as the central site of that development and where it carried through. I want readers to know about the experiences that came from Spain to the Americas, including the physical descriptions and in defects, for example, that they used to describe the enslaved in bill of sales. And that was used first in animal trading and animal sales. And of course, the resistance strategies apply and the everyday life of the enslaved and free Blacks in the Americas. Also, because topics that dominate the scholarship in the Dominican Republic include the European conquest, the treatment of the Taino Arawaks, nationalism, anti-Haitianism, the dictatorship of Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, and race and identity. However, race and identity has not been addressed from the focal point of slavery and post-colonial theory. In Puerto Rico, for example, some of the most popular topics include nationalism and the Spanish-American War and Puerto Rico-US relations. And I'm also going to quote snippets from the book. For example, contrary to the focus of many scholarly works, sugarcane and Black African slaves were first introduced to Santo Domingo, what became the Spanish side of the island of Hispaniola, and not Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti. While the topic of slavery in Puerto Rico has been carefully studied, Jorge Luis Chinea points out that when compared to other islands that partook in the transatlantic slave trade, Puerto Rico does not rank among the top in the scholarship about slavery. This work is also a small act of rebellion against the scholarship. Logan Dubois and Richard Lee Turrett refer to the Caribbean as the centerpiece, land that was, and I open the quote, contested in struggles for autonomy or wealth, close quote. Nonetheless, part of that Caribbean centerpiece has not been properly included in its interconnectedness in the scholarship of Caribbean slavery. And I argue that scholars have claimed that the paleographic documents are hard to decipher, yet they, for decades, have been transcribing paleographic documents to write about sugar and not to write about the people, the Black people who produce the sugar, and also the Black people who produce people as property and product. This book is an invitation for scholars to follow the people. For example, the origin, and I'll just mention a few, of enslaved Blacks in Santo Domingo included Bantu from Congo, Akan from Ghana, Arara from Benin, Yoruba from Nigeria, Igbo from Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea, and also Bran from Equatorial Guinea, right? The registered number of enslaved Black population in Santo Domingo begins in 1518, when the asiento was first introduced in the Americas. This trading license was created for the importation of 4,000 enslaved people, and subsequently the sources report that about 20,000 enslaved Blacks were in Santo Domingo in 1503, 30,000 in 1543, and in 1606, approximately 9,648 in a population of about 12,000 people in the entire island. I also wanted to highlight in detail important information like naming in the region in academic scholarship, and I make emphasis on this. There's one footnote that is very long and that has a purpose. For example, the lack of consistency in properly situating the history of Hispaniola, referring to it with various names, has contributed in a way to what Dixa Ramirez calls ghosting. An example is a very popular book by Frank Tannenbaum, his citation of Henry Brougham's work and an inquiry into the colonial policy of the European powers. Citing Brougham, Tannenbaum says that the French brought over 29,000 slaves to Santo Domingo in 1788, whereas Brougham refers to the place as Saint Domingo. They're both referring to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, and not Santo Domingo. And this is all included in the introduction. I'll now share brief summaries about the chapters again that other contributors are not here to share, and finally about my contribution, which is chapter 5. Chapter 1, Spanish slave legislation from slavery to abolition in Spain and the Americas by Aurelia Martín Casares, explains the history of servitude in Spain, citing that emperors used to execute their prisoners until they thought it was a good idea to make use of them and have them serve. According to Casares, the Siete Partidas clearly established the reason for which people could be enslaved, and that was war, capture in war as an enemy of faith, or through birth, born to a slave mother, even if the father was a free man. And this is from Title 21 in the fourth partida in the book. This legislation was inherited from the Roman law. And the author also explains that colonizers began to create wars between African ethnic groups to benefit from the wars and kidnap people for trade. And her chapter presents also the process of the introduction of slavery in Spain and the Spanish colonies, and also her view on the process of abolition of slavery. Chapter 2 by Rocio Periañez Gomez, Legislation and Slavery from a Local Perspective, Slaves in the Municipal Ordinances of Extremadura. This chapter discusses the municipal laws in the province of Extremadura, and these laws serve as a window to understanding the life of enslaved in a community, of the enslaved in a community that sought to control their presence and also their actions. However, Periañez, she warns the reader that while local laws can be a great resource, we must be careful when using them and analyzing them as a source, because they were created to correct and punish deviant behavior, and they can contribute to prejudices on Black people. The laws analyzed include 8 cities of the province of Extremadura and also other places for comparative purposes. Some laws that I just took out to share with you today include laws in 1529 Malaga, 1537 Cuba, and 1558 Cartagena. And this was the law that the enslaved were not allowed to purchase wine. So, and no alcohol in general was to be sold in any place or served to the enslaved by bars. And another interesting law in 1527 Seville and Granada prohibited the enslaved from learning to weave linen. And we move to chapter 6 with Transgressing Social, Gender, and Sexual Norms in Colonial Santo Domingo by Jacqueline Jimenez Polanco. This chapter follows the lives of María de las Nieves, Isabel Lorenzo, María Magdalena, and Andrea Diaz. María de las Nieves, María Magdalena, and Andrea Diaz were 3 mulata women from Santo Domingo, whereas Isabel Lorenzo was born in the Canary Islands. And the women in this chapter defied the status quo dictated by the church and the state on marriage and how they should live their lives. It becomes a back and forth trial about the women's everyday life, quotidian style. And they were single mothers who claimed to rent their homes and laundry services to men and women to support their families. When taken to court, witnesses shared that they consider the women to be prostitutes because of how they lived and how they argued and the things that they used to say to each other when they used to get mad at each other. So it becomes como un chisme. Chapter 7, Fostering a Sense of Community in 17th Century Puerto Rico, the Godparenthood of Enslaved Infants, Children, and Adults in San Juan by David Stark. This chapter, and I'm quoting, David examines godparent selection for 795 enslaved infants and 182 enslaved adults baptized in San Juan. According to David, he selected San Juan because he has the oldest series of parish registers on the island for a period that is one of the least studied in the Spanish Caribbean. And he found that many of the godfathers were soldiers and that 51% of godparents were above the rank of a second lieutenant. The social class of the godparent was relevant, especially in the case of enslaved people, because it potentially allowed them opportunity or proximity to opportunities that they otherwise could not have. Lower class people, including soldiers who accepted to be godparent, mainly did so because the responsibility and title of godparent gave them honor and a position of trust in society that could possibly pave the way for them to have other opportunities, believe it or not. And finally, my chapter 5, Black Women in 16th Century Santo Domingo, Free Enslaved Founders and Explorers. There are documented cases of Black women ohras, from the word ahorrar, meaning free, so they saved for their freedom, who requested travel licenses to travel to Hispaniola, accompanied by their sons or daughters, as early as the second decade after the founding of the colony. The request for travel licenses by free Black women continued throughout the development of colonial society in Santo Domingo. And I cite the case of Maria de Cota, who requested a travel license to go to Peru from Seville. She received the travel license in 1775, stayed in Santo Domingo because it was the layover to go to other colonies. But then we find her again in Spain, again requesting a travel license to go to Peru, and now with her daughter that apparently she had while she was in Santo Domingo. There were also enslaved women who now allow us to learn more about the everyday happenings of colonial Santo Domingo through their stories. For example, I wrote a chapter, an article on Juana Gelofa Pelona, and the article doesn't have a paywall. I'll share the link on the chat. I tried to tell her full story. Juana Gelofa was an enslaved woman in 1549 Santo Domingo who was asked to testify again in favor of her enslaver. And they told her, go and testify and we're going to give you gifts. So she went and testified and said, well, they said, if I don't say what I know, they'll give me gifts. Then they said, well, you have to take her to change her mind. They said, you have to change your mind or we're going to whip you. She said, well, they said, if I don't change my mind, they're going to whip me. Then they sent her back and they said, if you don't change your mind, we're going to burn you with hot wax. And she went and she said, well, they say they're going to burn me with hot wax. And they did. And eventually they ended up selling her to an enslaver in Cape Haitian, all the way across the island so that they couldn't reach Juana, but they also couldn't avoid that. And the title of the article is Juana Gelofa Pelona, an enslaved but insubordinate witness in Santo Domingo. Her bill of sale says, we selling her not because she's a maroon who likes to escape, but because she talks too much. Free Black women were also part of the formal and informal economy of the island. We have Black women identified as mulata or Black, owning farms, homes, stores, and also owning enslaved people. And finally, one of my favorite cases is the case of Manuela in 1699 Santo Domingo, a young enslaved woman from Congo who is inherited by her mistress, children. It's 4 of them. One of the brothers sells his 1/4 of Manuela to his brother Domingo Diaz, and how they are administering or distributing Manuela is not explained in the bill of sale. What is clearly stated is that Hill, the buyer, the seller, sold his share of Manuela, the property, to Diaz, who now had access to 1/4 of Manuela, and I quote, and can sell her, trade, exchange, annex, and have access to it as he wished. And these are some of the stories that I wish that other people can pick on and we can continue to build in terms of slavery in Santo Domingo, because we still have that gap. And I think I did that in 14 minutes.
Thank you, Lissette. And who is the next contributor who will take the floor?
We should go in order. Should we go with
Okay, go
Richard?
ahead.
We can go with Richard, then Anthony, and then Chinea, if you all agree.
Sure. Okay. So thanks so much, Anna, and thank for organizing this event. Thanks again to Lissette for inviting me to be part of the book. Really appreciate that. And of course, thanks to the audience for coming in on well, at least what's here is a very nice sunny day. So I appreciate it. I was asked to do a 20-minute talk, so I'll try to do my best. The title of the talk, I mean, it's the chapter in summary, and the title of the talk is From Slavery to Freedom in Early Colonial Santo Domingo. On October 10th, 1531, Rodrigo Lopez, identified as, quote, of black color, appeared before the Audiencia of Santo Domingo, the ruling body and highest court for this first Spanish colony in the Americas. Lopez, who was then enslaved, came to court to claim that he had the right to be free. He asked the court to overturn a prior ruling rejecting a similar claim of wrongful enslavement, one that he had made several years earlier before a lower court judge in Cubagua. That island off the coast of Venezuela was also colonized by Spain, and Lopez and his putative owner were living there at the time. Since losing that case, Lopez had been sold to a new owner who had taken him to Santo Domingo. Lopez would benefit from this, his fifth sale, which placed him in one of the administrative centers of Spain's new American empire, as well as at the heart of an emerging Atlantic world of slavery. Lopez benefited because there, the Audiencia found that he should, in fact, be free. Lopez's victory in one of the earliest freedom suits in the Americas was the product of an extraordinary series of events driven mostly by the actions of people of African descent, enslaved and free, living in this new transatlantic world. In my chapter in Transatlantic Bondage, I tell the story of Lopez's remarkable journey to freedom, and I set Lopez's experiences within the context of the larger history of slavery and freedom in Santo Domingo, which I also explore in my forthcoming book, Enslaved New World. I show how in Santo Domingo, where by the 1520s Europeans had established the America's first plantation economy, slavery grew to almost unprecedented proportions, and by mid-century became for the first time isolated to people of African descent. This contrasted with the multiracial slavery of late medieval and early modern Southern Europe. Santo Domingo's plantation economy and soon exclusively Black slavery launched a trajectory that would be repeated throughout the Americas. Rodrigo Lopez's life was immersed in these historical developments. Rodrigo Lopez's story begins in Portugal, where he was born into slavery and given the family name of the man who owned him, Rui Lopez. Rodrigo was taught to read and write and thereby attained skills that were exceptional even for a free person at the time. This prepared him eventually to help administer Ruiz's cotton plantation in the Portuguese colony of Cape Verde, to where Rui had moved, and to work in his slave trading operations on these islands and on the nearby West African coast. Specifically, Rodrigo oversaw the loading and the readying of slave ships. In 1522, Rui completed his will, and in it he granted freedom to Rodrigo and to Rodrigo's sister Catalina on the condition that Rodrigo continue to administer Ruiz's businesses. This arrangement was to last for 3 years, after which Rodrigo was to sell his former owner's estate and pay off his debts. During those 3 years, Rodrigo would remain in a type of legal limbo between free and enslaved, under the custody of the executor of the will, but also essentially free, and obliged himself to run a major slave trading operation. Around 1525, with little time left to go before Rodrigo's 3 years were up, and he was to receive his full legal freedom, Ruiz's nephew, Cristobal Gonzalez, showed up at the estate and started taking Ruiz's belongings. When Rodrigo objected, Gonzalez kidnapped him and sold him to a ship captain named Juan Sombrero. The captain in turn sold Rodrigo to someone else who brought him to Cubagua. When Rodrigo protested that he was in fact a free man, he was whipped, imprisoned, and then sold again, this time to Juan de la Barrera. It was at this point that Lopez managed to have his case heard by Cubaguan authorities. Multiple witnesses testified on Lopez's behalf. Nonetheless, on December 5th, 1528, the judge ruled Lopez had not, quote, proven his liberty. Following the court's decision, Barrera sold his highly skilled property in man to another buyer, who in turn sold him yet again to Rodrigo de Leon. It was Leon who took Lopez to Santo Domingo. Lopez's new residence, a large island of mostly untamed woods roughly the size of Portugal, had only recently become home to dozens of large sugar plantations. Spanish conquerors initially made gold mining the main industry in Santo Domingo, but by the late 1510s, mines were becoming less productive. As the bullion economy declined, European colonists expanded sugar production, and as sugar took off, so did the importation of enslaved laborers. With a modest-sized population of European immigrants and a once massive native population decimated by illness, violence, and overwork, Santo Domingo was quickly transformed into a society in which most of the population was enslaved. The fever pitch of the African Atlantic slave trade in the 1520s was reflected in Rodrigo Lopez's life history. He was sold 5 times along the journey that ended for him in Santo Domingo, and there he was rented out and sold for a 6th time, even in the very moment that he was in court suing for his freedom. This last sale reflects the intensity of the demand for enslaved labor in Santo Domingo. The New World slavery in which Lopez was held captive was developing in virtually unprecedented ways in terms of the demography of the enslaved. For here, slavery would be soon isolated to one group, people of African descent. This was in stark contrast to the multiple and diverse simultaneous slave trades in 15th century Southern Europe, and even in the Americas in the early 16th century, when above all, quote, Indians, as Spaniards named all people native to the Americas, composed a substantial portion of enslaved workers in Santo Domingo. Alongside a system of forced labor imposed on the island's native population, a vast trade developed that involved Europeans enslaving and exporting to Santo Domingo tens of thousands of people from other parts of the Americas, especially the Greater Caribbean. Spaniards captured and imported people on islands and continental areas not yet at least sought as places for active colonization, such as the Bahamas. Large numbers across the expanding Spanish Empire were also taken as prisoners and enslaved during wars of resistance to Spanish rule. Lopez's 4th owner, Juan de la Barrera, was primarily a trader in enslaved indigenous Americans, operating out of both Cubagua and Santo Domingo. Across Spanish America in the early 16th century, a small number of people of European, Eurasian, and North African origins were also enslaved. They had been brought to the Americas from Southern Europe, where the holding of human property had been a familiar part of society, even prior to the African Atlantic slave trade. For instance, in the early 1400s, nearly 1 in 10 persons in the Spanish city of Valencia was owned by another person. Probably about half of those enslaved were Orthodox Christians from Eastern Europe and Eurasia, brought to Spain via the Black Sea slave trade, and the rest mostly from Muslim ruled areas of Spain and North Africa, with which Christian Spain had been at war for centuries. Notably, in Southern Europe, it was freedom that was isolated to one group, to co-religionists, specifically fellow Roman Catholics, not slavery. Southern Europe's historically diverse slave population remained evident in early 16th century Santo Domingo. In this period, the crown, I heard someone coming through. Can I be heard all right?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, sorry. All right, in this period, in 16th century Santo Domingo, the crown issued hundreds of licenses to bring slaves identified as white to the island and elsewhere in the Americas. Slavery was also not immediately limited to non-whites and Spanish colonists' laws and imagination. Slave codes in 1520 Santo Domingo made frequent reference to white, black, and other slaves. Yet the possibility of white slaves was in practice increasingly remote by the time Rodrigo Lopez arrived in Santo Domingo. The Catholic conquest of all Spain and the diversion of the Black Sea slave trade to the expanding Ottoman Empire depleted the traditional sources of Southern European slaves. In the same period that the Portuguese reached sub-Saharan Africa by ship for the first time in the 1440s. Large numbers of enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa had long been brought to the Mediterranean and elsewhere by North African traders crossing the Sahara, but now Europeans could divert and augment this trade at a comparatively low cost, and they immediately began forcibly transporting enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa to Spain, Portugal, and their nearby Atlantic island possessions. Furthermore, in the first half of the 16th century, the spread and the stabilization of Spain's overseas rule in the Americas led the Crown to increasingly limit those areas where the indigenous population could be enslaved. There were fewer places where Spain was still legally at war, and continuing enslavement in areas where Spanish rule was already established provoked local rebellion and flight. But Crown efforts to restrict indigenous enslavement to legal prisoners of war often proved impossible to enforce. This was the main reason the king offered for decrees in the 1530s and more permanently in the 1540s that rejected altogether any new enslavement among native populations, even in war, since this was often no more than pretext. Major exceptions would be made elsewhere until the late 1600s, but in Santo Domingo, the enslavement of people native to the Americas came to a sudden and dramatic halt. After the mid-1500s, bondage in Santo Domingo became limited, almost entirely to African descendants. In the context of the growing equation of Blackness and slavery, free people of African origin were especially vulnerable to illegal re-enslavement, even if they had secured freedom through legal manumission. The proceedings and verdict in Lopez's first case make clear how difficult it was to prove wrongful enslavement and how the law favored de facto owners. Most of the witnesses in this case were sailors working on ships that traveled back and forth between Cape Verde and the Caribbean. Some testified that they had seen Lopez in Cape Verde. Many remembered him being elegantly dressed. One recalled him with papers in his hand, indicating that he was literate. Another testified that a cobbler in Cape Verde had explained to him that Lopez was a freed man, hence his refined manner. A sailor who traveled to Cubagua on the same ship as the re-enslaved Lopez did testified that he heard people on board discussing the fact that Lopez was being taken away by traders as if he were a slave, even though he had been a free man in Cape Verde. Another testified that Sombrero, the trader bringing Lopez from Cape Verde, had shared that he had purchased Lopez from a Portuguese man who had insisted that, quote, he not leave the said black in any land within the Portuguese Empire. The seller stressed that Lopez could read and write and thus might get into a legal battle with Sombrero otherwise. The testimony strongly suggested that both Gonzalez and Sombrero knew full well that Lopez was free and that selling him was illegal. Nonetheless, Lopez lost his case. Yet freedom suits, however unfairly problematic, were not just farces in the early 16th century Spanish Empire. This should not be surprising, given that freedom suits were well-established Spanish legal processes, which long predated the Spanish conquest of the Americas and the African Atlantic slave trade. After arriving in Santo Domingo, Lopez appealed his case to the audiencia there, and this time he won his freedom, despite powerful opponents on the island with a direct interest in his enslavement. Even during the proceedings, Lopez was again purchased, despite the possibility that he could be freed in the end. His new owner, Diego Caballero, was a wealthy planter, an accountant of the royal treasury, and a former secretary of the audiencia itself. Acting against the interests of Caballero and other slave owners, the audiencia declared Lopez free. It seems that Lopez was successful in appeal because he did not rely this time on what could be classified as hearsay, but rather on written documentary evidence. Lopez almost miraculously obtained this evidence from his freed sister, Catalina, who had remained in Cape Verde. There isn't enough information to sketch out every step of the suspenseful and heroic story of Catalina and Rodrigo Lopez's transatlantic collaboration. The record does show, however, that sometime after her brother's disappearance, a sailor informed Catalina that Rodrigo had been kidnapped, enslaved, and taken to Cubagua. Hoping to liberate him, Catalina obtained a notarized copy of Ruy Lopez's will, freeing her and her brother. She then took the document to the port of Ribera Grande in Cape Verde, where European ships came for the purchase of enslaved Africans, who would then be exported to the Caribbean. Conceivably offering money for this service, Catalina found a sailor. They are willing to try to find Rodrigo and bring the mentioned document to him, of course without anything akin to an address. Amazingly, 2 years later, the document had made its way to Rodrigo in Santo Domingo, presumably by way of Cubagua, the last place Catalina knew he had been sighted. This was the written evidence that Rodrigo Lopez presented to the judges of the audiencia, who then declared that he was in fact a free man. Evidently, notarized documents could not be discounted with ease. Of course, Lopez's history also manifests how tragically problematic the law could be in challenging illegal enslavement. Those hoping to sue for their freedom had to first reach Spanish judicial officials, no easy feat for most people in bondage, who also ran the risk of brutal retaliation by owners for attempting to contact authorities. And they had to convince a judge that their case was plausible enough to be heard. Finally, the plaintiff had to prevail in terms of evidence, specifically written evidence. As was the case in Lopez's suit, in practice, the burden of proof fell on the enslaved, who would be required to demonstrate that they had been manumitted, rather than an alleged owner having to prove that the person they claimed to own was still legally a slave. It is noteworthy that Sombrero and Gonzalez anticipated that taking Lopez to the Americas could keep him at a safe distance from the law. Gonzalez also apparently found partners in crime who appeared to have thought it unnecessary to be secretive about this illegal operation. This is suggested by the numerous sailors who reported overhearing conversations about Lopez having been a freed man who was kidnapped and sold back into slavery. What those illegally enslaving and exporting Lopez failed to anticipate, though, was how new forms of globalization, produced by the African Atlantic slave trade, could also be exploited by people resisting slavery. Sailors crisscrossing the Atlantic linked ordinary people as well as slavers, markets, and empires across 3 continents. Those sailors, too, included a significant number of free people of sub-Saharan African descent. It was the remarkable collaboration with sailors traveling between Cape Verde, Cubagua, and Santo Domingo that made it possible for Rodrigo and Catalina Lopez to communicate and send documentation across the Atlantic, now a veritable highway and its shores bustling centers for overseas news. It's unclear whether Rodrigo Lopez chose to remain in Santo Domingo after the triumph of his suit, but if he did, he would have witnessed the consolidation of a slave society. By the 1540s, the island's enslaved population had reached approximately 15,000, while there were just some 5,000 Europeans, and the number of slaves would subsequently rise, probably to some 20,000, even with the freeing or exporting of 5,000 American natives who had been enslaved there. Santo Domingo's plantation economy was so dramatic for the time that the late 18th century Martinican-born scholar Leroux de Saint-Marie would recall it as, quote, the prototype of all the sugar and slave colonies that developed later in the Americas. Yet Europeans' wealth rested on unstable foundations in Santo Domingo. The law denied the majority their will and freedom. The widespread resistance this inevitably produced proved unstoppable. So the colonial state's repressive apparatus was not up to the task for an island as large, wooded, mountainous, mostly unsettled, and teeming with wildlife as Santo Domingo. This exceptionally escape-friendly ecology offered relatively ample opportunity for people to flee to freedom and to subsist in invisible or inaccessible spaces. By the 1540s, the number of people who had emancipated themselves was well into the thousands. At that time, many formed bands who went on the attack against slave owners, burning plantations and liberating many still in chains. There were armed rebellions against enslavement in the 1520s and 1580s as well. By the mid-1580s, the sugar industry began a gradual decline, and the ginger plantations that increasingly took its place followed suit several decades later. By the 1640s, Santo Domingo's plantation economy was gone. The relative ease and constancy of escape played a critical role in this downfall. For every person who escaped, decreased the plantation's capital and productivity in an increasingly competitive global market, as did high taxes to support state campaigns to try to recapture those who had fled to freedom and to battle formerly enslaved rebels. Astonishingly, in comparative perspective, by the mid-17th century, most of those who had been enslaved at the start of the century had escaped from bondage. And the white elite soon had to recognize this quasi-revolutionary transformation as irreversible and the self-emancipated as de facto free. Those who had been enslaved had managed to transform society from one mostly of enslaved African descendants to one mostly of free African descendants over just 50 years' time. Even if Rodrigo Lopez had decided to live out his days in Santo Domingo, he could not, alas, have lived long enough to see the land where he had proven his liberty become one with a free African-descended majority. This free population experienced what was certainly a constrained liberty, as they lived within an empire where legal racial hierarchy prevailed. And a substantial 15% of people remained enslaved until Santo Domingo imported the Haitian Revolution through annexation to Haiti in 1822. Still, 150 years before slavery legally came to an end, most of the once majority enslaved population had emancipated themselves and were living economically independent lives. Probably most Dominicans today are the offspring of individuals who escaped from bondage. Others have ancestors like Rodrigo Lopez, who freed themselves in the courtroom by suing their enslavers. Others managed to purchase their own freedom. Dominicans thus descend from an extraordinary lineage of successful self-emancipation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. Then, Lissette, I leave you with the task of deciding who is next.
We move on with Anthony Stevens in chapter 4 about laws and resistance.
Okay, let's see if let me just add him the spotlight. Here we go. You just have to unmute yourself, Anthony.
Yes, I just did. Very glad to be here. Very, very pleased for the occasion of getting together and sharing comments on our respective chapters. I just want to kind of point a few issues regarding, let's say, how now I look at the chapter itself as a product of something I did 3, 4, 5 years ago. Actually, the story of the chapter, in my case, whose title is African Slavery and Laws in La Española, is actually an offshoot, I think is the word in English, of a prior shorter study that I did while I was a staff researcher at the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute on the issue of the 1521 rebellion that has gone on the record as the first known rebellion, the first black-led anti-slavery rebellion of the Americas. And through that exercise, I began to realize that laws or the earlier version of the slave codes as the Spaniards were producing them in Santo Domingo could actually be a source to find additional information about the society that produced those laws. Earlier on, when I was younger than the age I was at the time when I did the research and wrote the article, the chapter, I used to think as a result of a theoretical approach and worldview when I was a younger man that had a lot to do with the Marxist thought that was spreading throughout the Americas. I tended to disregard the value, let's say the historical source value of laws at the time, because I felt, as many of you know, the Marxist simplistic scheme that laws are cultural products, therefore part of the ideological superstructure of a society, in this case, Santo Domingo 16th century society, and that therefore there wasn't that much to look into laws because they did not reflect supposedly or adequately the society or the social dynamics of the society that produced them. But in time, and when I was researching the 1521 rebellion, I realized that this particular code that was issued by the local governor and viceroy Diego Colón, one of Christopher Columbus's children, actually could be read in a way that would provide some interesting information about the local social dynamics that Richard already was referring to, especially in the earlier period of the century. And I sort of, and by the way, I probably gathered this idea from other historians that I had read before, whose names I don't recall, in terms of looking at the laws as in the following way. Laws tend to regulate and prohibit things, prohibit behaviors, punish behaviors. But behaviors that are either happening or expected to happen, or the powerful in society being afraid that they might happen. So I decided that reading the 1521 laws was a good way to see through the statements in the laws entries about the punishments of certain behaviors. It was definitely a lens through which to spot and identify certain behaviors that the enslaved people or Black people in general were engaging in at the time. So it became something very interesting, very appealing, and that's the root origin of this chapter, in which what I did was, after doing the first study about the 1522 laws or ordenanzas or code that the Spaniards issued as a way to try to prevent and avoid another insurrection like the one that happened in the Christmas time of 1521, there were other laws issued, not many, but some, all the way into the mid 16th century, which had not been studied that much, and I felt they were also worthy of looking into in the same way as the laws of January 1522 had revealed. So I looked at those laws and tried to squeeze out of them whatever they would reveal about, let's say, the power dynamics between the colonizers and the Black population in general, especially the enslaved people. And as a result, the chapter spells out a number of issues like that clearly show, in my view, the agency of this subaltern population that was formed by, as Richard was saying, this majority, already a majority of Afro-descending population in the colony and the island. So that connects also with a concern of mine in the last few years, in terms of wondering and asking myself, okay, what is it that I can best try to achieve in looking at the Dominican 16th century and connecting it to the present, in the sense of trying to find in the 16th century whatever historical legacy could be present today in Dominican society. Issues like, the overwhelming population, evidently Afro-Dominican, that constitutes the majority of the Dominican population nowadays, and also questions about to what extent that early intensive slavery, plantation slavery past might have had a long-term impact in how Dominican society is structured today, to put it simply, in terms of the possible correlations of the certain Dominicans' racial phenotype or ancestry and their socioeconomic conditions or status within Dominican contemporary society. So I studied that first half of the 16th century and found resistance, found solidarity, found collaboration between non-enslaved, that is free people, and enslaved people in terms of resisting slavery, found this systemic strategy of repression and attempt to control the Black population, and especially the enslaved population, though, and Richard was referring to also to this. In general, my impression from reading those laws is that from early on, probably already from the 1520s, the word negro already in Dominican society had become the label to identify or convey mean an enslaved status. And that connects also to a very interesting phenomenon that we still need to discuss more in terms of present-day Dominican society. Remember, again, recently my obsession has been every time I find a little piece of info about Black people in Dominican 16th century, right away the question is, okay, does this tell me something about the Dominican present-day society? Is there a connection there? And I remember Richard himself and other authors, other historians referring in the past to the fact that those dynamics that occurred during the 16th century that Richard was referring to as this, let's say, mass liberation phenomenon obtained by enslaved by Black people, not through direct confrontation, but by fleeing into the inhabited areas of the Santo Domingo Island, probably had a very important long-term impact in terms of how Dominican contemporary society, present-day society, functions and works, and its outlook racially and socially. This issue of a lot of the early Black population in Santo Domingo becoming free through their own means, either by rebelling and mostly by running away, putting themselves in places of freedom away from the control of the planters and the Spanish colonizers, leads to a very valid argument that if most of the Black enslaved population ran away into the countryside and the monte, the wilderness, and they for a long time became the early campesinos of Dominican society. And then we acknowledge nowadays, and I think this is a fact, that most Dominicans would accept that they themselves, younger generations, people like us, most Dominicans would acknowledge nowadays that they are descendants of ancestors that were campesino people. Many Dominicans will tell you, my grandfather was a farmer, a small farmer, a small landowner. If that is the case, then it's not that hard to reasonably construct the connection that if the first campesinos in Santo Domingo were formerly enslaved Black people, that is to say, Afro-descendants, and most of Dominicans today would admit and acknowledge that they themselves are the descendants of campesino people, then it seems rather understandable that there might be a historical connection there between the early free Black rural population of Santo Domingo as the ascendants of most Dominicans that live today, even when, because of lack of information or lack of formal education, and because of the distortions of the Dominican educational system in regards to how the Dominican history has been portrayed, most Dominicans probably would not spontaneously make that conceptual connection between knowing that they are the descendants of campesinos and at the same time knowing that that means that they are descendants of early enslaved Black population that by engaging in this agency on their own they became the first the first free Black population of the Americas. And this is a matter that needs a lot of more discussions. I bet you, I bet to all of you that if we were to pose this matter in these terms in a public, let's say, educational or cultural forum in the Dominican Republic today, even amongst educated Dominicans, we would find a lot of resistance in terms of admitting that this historical process might have been such. And at the same time, it has implications in terms of the debate put forth by other analysts that have been trying to construct a more critical view of the whole thing of racial dynamics. And I'm going to say this here probably the first time in such a large group. You know, one of the issues that concern me when it comes to this research, again, I'm jumping from 1520 Santo Domingo to today's Dominican Republic. Okay, that's the way I see historiographical work nowadays at my age. Okay, sorry, that's how it is. But the point is that in trying to understand Dominicans as a people, like in any other case of any other people of the world, okay, based on their history and their historical lived experience, trying to speculate and analyze, you know, not being an ethnographer or an anthropologist right there on site to do it, but by using the historical record, the archival materials. In the last few years, I have been wondering about something like the following. Some people claim that too many Dominicans, or even some say Dominicans in general, have a problem in terms of identifying themselves as Blacks. Okay, that even when it's obvious that phenotypically, racially, many Dominicans are Afro-descendants, that for some reason Dominicans have a problem in not verbally, explicitly admitting that they are Blacks. And after a lot of thought about this, especially provoked by the historical reading of documents, okay, as a common sense, as a simple citizen living here in the United States and having the, let's say, the biographical privilege of witnessing the social political life of the United States in the last 40 years, it's obvious, for instance, that in U.S. Official culture, or social culture, if you want, and political culture, the so-called N word is considered an insult. The word nigger. Okay, good. Then I wonder, and again, I'm simplifying a lot this reasoning. Okay, so I say, okay, the same way I can perfectly understand, and this has to do with the meaning and the etymology of words. By the way, which is an important piece. If I can easily understand that African Americans, for instance, as the most directly affected group in this regard, or people in general in the United States, have come to the cultural convention, the consensus that the word nigger is an insulting word that therefore should not be used or applied to anyone. But understanding that this is a word that etymologically comes from either the Spanish or because I haven't done that study, either the Spanish or the Latin, okay, word meaning blackness, nigger, okay, negro, okay. So if it's understandable that in U.S. society that word has become a cultural no-no or taboo, what is the problem then in understanding, or at least considering, the possibility that in a society like the Dominican Republic, the prior Santo Domingo, because of the association of, since early on, of the word negro with the word slave, enslaved Afro-descendant Dominicans might have ended up rejecting the word. especially when they have a number of alternate words like moreno to express blackness. So I wonder, and I wish an ethnographer would spend 5 years studying this in the Dominican Republic. I wonder to what extent when Dominicans or many Dominicans are asked, are you black? That is to say, in Spanish, are you negro? And the guy would respond, no, yo no soy negro, yo soy dominicano, or yo soy moreno. Or if we see the possible connection of hiding or running away from the label, from the racial label expressed by the word negro, as a result of a strategy to distance themselves from the imagination and the notion of enslaved status, then I think it makes a lot of sense. But anyway, that's an offshoot of where I have one of the corners, so to speak, that I have ended up in terms of historical thinking and analysis applied to present day Dominican society as a result of this study that began early on when about 10 or 14 years ago, 2016, at the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute, those of us that were there, Lissette, myself, the other colleagues that are still at the Institute under the direction of Dr. Ramona Hernandez, we began pushing for this dusting off and recovery of historical data of the early presence or the start of the presence of Black people in Dominican society. I think I referred to the fact that I did that study on the 16th century. Now I hope soon I could sit down also with the 18th century codes, the famoso Código Negro, the Black Code of Santo Domingo, because I feel that it's going to be very interesting to look at what happened to the laws about Black people in Santo Domingo 300 years later or 200 years later, after the initial codes that were produced by the intensive slavery plantation system, and what we might find, the same way that I read a number of, okay, Alex, see you. The same way I found a number of dynamics reflected in the laws, probably the 18th century Black Code is going to show us a good set of dynamics that would help explain even further present day Dominican society in terms of its racial dynamics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I pass now to Alex.
Well, no, my job here is done. I was just letting Anthony know that like a 2-minute warning, but so that we can have room for the for our other guests.
We can move on to chapter 8 with Jorge Chinea. Thank you, Alex.
Well, saludos. I'm coming to you from Michigan, state of Michigan. First of all, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
My camera system is not working, so I'm going to confine myself to not a formal talk, but to a couple of points to kind of track down for the listeners some of the hurdles and some of the ways we try to do some problem solving in deciphering what that colonial past that Anthony was referring to, because we are inheritors of the colonial heritage of Latin America. And that colonial heritage really hovers, right, in practically everything we do, and the historical discourse is not exempt from it. We are essentially dealing with documents, as the Cuban historian Manuel Moreno Frajinals once said, that are previamente depurados, or previously cleaned out. In other words, the colonial library, or those materials that we now use to tell the history of our people, are documents that were assembled by people way before our time, under very specific conditions in which the people that were participating in assembling those documents had something to gain or lose about what was put on those records. Keep in mind that when the Europeans came to the New World, they didn't come to fail, right? They came to hacer la América, to make it in America. And what that meant for them was that they were taking a chance in crossing the Atlantic. And oftentimes they did so under the protection of some individual that provided for the passage and for the food and the clothing, and sometimes for the job that they will have when they made it across. A lot of those people were not necessarily your upper classes in Europe, right? They were not the adelantados, the hidalgos, the duques, the marqueses, the counts. They were the average people, but unfortunately, as history will show, a lot of them fell victims to the greed of the conquest and colonization of the Americas, and a lot of them wanted to bring something back. They wanted to become Indianos, right? Indianos meaning I lived in the Americas, made a lot of money, I stuffed my pockets. Now I'm going to come back as an Hidalgo. People are going to respect me. I'm going to be someone, Hidalgo, hijo de algo, right? A son of something. So I'm going to take that back with me, and I'm going to change my life, and hopefully take the people from the Pueblo Llano, the people from the lower classes like I was, and help them get out of poverty. But unfortunately, that story is not well known, right? Luis Manuel Diaz Soler, the historian, once said that the conquest and colonization of the Americas was led by the well-off people, but it was conducted by el pueblo llano, by the people who were poor, who didn't have many options back in Spain, ¿verdad? Mule drivers and shoemakers and tanners and all kinds of people who were either forced to come along through the enganche system that they had in time, or they put them in the military, or they simply opted to take a chance in crossing the Atlantic. The other part of that Anthony was referencing is the colonial archives. And the colonial archives are colored by a Eurocentric mold that permeates pretty much everything we read in it. So our job as investigators is to try to sift through all that jargon and trying to figure out why and how they use these words and what they meant to them, and how they created a whole new language to carry out the colonial project. This language is not accidental, right? This language is very purposeful. It was designed to carry out a narrative, to build a language that will sustain the colonial project. And so it created a whole bunch of castas, right? Caste system. And the people within those caste systems were given certain attributes, social, political, and economics, that supposedly they were to have, right? And the people in power operated on that basis, right? If you were poor, they assumed that there were some characteristics that applied to you. And in reality, sometimes you didn't get around to getting an education and making wealth, so it sort of stuck with you, and you got stranded in the historical process as a minoritized person as a result of that. So who are these people that are creating this? The people who are creating this language and are creating these conditions are people who value honor, calidad, or background, nobility status, and the prospect for social mobility. You have to keep in mind that a lot of these persons, in the case of the contrabando or the smuggling of human beings, everybody participated on it. It was not confined to just planters and estancieros or cattle ranchers who decided overnight, I need some workers, let me start doing some dealing and wheeling and get some people here. This was done by everybody, the priest, the artisans, the housewives, right? The military men, the governors, the treasury officials. Everybody was on the take. In fact, smuggling or contrabando was so widespread that practically every governor of the 17th century was somehow implicated in contraband. This, despite the fact that at the time and all throughout the Spanish colonial period, Spanish officials were expected to undergo a residencia or an evaluation of the terms of office, at which point they would invite people from the community, literally, to come in and start telling them what was going on that the government doesn't know about. And it was at that point that a lot of people would come out and say, well, he or she has this many servants in the house. He or she, mistreated this person. He or she conducted this fraudulent activity. But they still did it. So it was a career sort of breaking moment. You can either escape punishment, if you get higher ups in the Spanish imperial system that can speak for you and clear your name. That happened to a lot of people. I mean, we have Juan Prim in Puerto Rico, who did not engage in contraband, but he did something else. He retaliated against both the enslaved and free Black population in Puerto Rico. He instituted a Código Negro. And just giving an example to kind of match what Anthony was saying, and he punished a lot of people and he executed a lot of people. When he went back to Spain with a stained record, they still washed it up. They cleaned it out. He made it, he escaped punishment. He continued to be successful as a career official in the Spanish government. But anyway, to come back to what I was saying then, you have the motivations of the various people that are implicated in the establishment and of the colonial social order, from lower class to upper class. You have the colonial archives that is already compromised, right? Because the people who don't want to leave a stained record of their careers are going to make sure that nothing too bad is left in those records. Unfortunately, the Spanish system was an empire, and that empire was made up of multiple ministries and officers, and the government of the monarchy wanted to make sure that they get as much information as they could. So all that information could not be totally concealed. So us as investigators, we have a minefield potentially available to us if we can go through all the documentation and start digging up and finding all of the stuff out. All right, so why was contraband so popular in Puerto Rico, and how did it emerge as a force that it not only enabled people in Puerto Rico who own farms, who own cattle ranches, who own plantations to procure labor, but that also allowed the government to benefit from the labor of those enslaved workers that were being brought in illegally. Consider that the Spanish system began in Puerto Rico in 1508. The carimbo system was already in place by that time. This is the metal branding tool that they put on people's back, shoulders, and other areas of the body with an F for Fernando, or the abbreviated letters of the owner of that individual. It shows that that person paid the importation taxes on those enslaved people. Well, the carimbo mark was abolished in Puerto Rico in 1784, but before it was abolished, it was stolen. And it was stolen because the people were tired of paying the importation tax, and they made a copy for themselves and started using that copy to brand slaves. And in other instances, they didn't even bother to put the stamp on it. That was more work for them. They simply hid them in their plantations and continue as normal until the government found out that the majority of the slaves in Puerto Rico in the middle of the 18th century were actually smuggled into Puerto Rico. So why did people smuggle, right? People smuggle for two major reasons. One, the mining cycle in Puerto Rico that was very, lucrative in the early years of the 16th century, 1508 to about 1550, collapsed right around mid-century. The Indian population began to die off. the alluvial gold deposits dwindled. They were harder to get. People learned that Peru and Mexico were being colonized, and they fled the island. They left everything behind. So labor was very difficult to procure. And people started using illegal means to get that labor. So illegal trading in Puerto Rico is very old. It has a very old pedigree that traces back to the very early years of the 16th century. The word traditional contraband in the title of the book comes from a work from Arturo Morales Carrión, who, on commenting about the 1859 case of a slave ship that arrived in Puerto Rico illegally, stated that the consuls from France and England were already sitting on the coast, watching out for any slave ship that were likely to come, because the word was getting out that this was ongoing. Unfortunately, once the ship, anchored on the bay, the government officials, the gobernadores, made sure that those records look clean, right? So they will mislabel them. They are not slave ships. They are navíos descaminados, right? Ships that lost their way on the way somewhere else. We, the Puerto Rico, I guess, benefited from that, but I didn't benefit, obviously, right? The hacendados did. And then the other were arribadas forzosas. That is, a hurricane hit them, right? It damaged, something on the ship. You got to bring the ship in for repairs. Oh my God, we got 300 slaves. What are we going to do? Oh, well, can we kind of let them off right now? Is that okay? And of course, this is the way by which Puerto Rico was able to bring a lot of enslaved Africans that have escaped record keeping, because not all of those slaves were what we call fiscalized. In other words, they didn't go through the process of paying taxes. And because they were not taxed, they were also not enumerated. Francisco Moscoso noted that when he started doing his own independent work on the history of slavery in Ponce, Puerto Rico, he said that there are no serial records in Puerto Rico, the way you find them in Cuba and other West Indian islands, where you have like 1808, so many ships, 1809, 1810, like that. They're not like that. The slaves they were slipping in. People will meet them at the coast. The commander of the port will instruct the local military commander that you're going to get your cut. The treasury official will get a cut. The local jailers or the sanitation guy will get a cut, and there will be a cut saved aside for the governor. So everybody got a little portion of it, and the records were not kept. So that's how it was done in Puerto Rico. In addition to those people that came in illegally, the records were not kept for them. Puerto Rico was also engaged in slave trading. Slave stealing, which is the different form of procurement of labor. Essentially, these are individuals who went into the Caribbean islands that were under the control of Spain's enemy, France, Holland, Denmark, England, and they raided their villages, especially on the coast. They captured the enslaved people, put them on a ship, and sold them in Puerto Rico behind the scenes. Nobody knew about it. The names would be changed, and nobody would know about them. You could find a lot of records like that in Puerto Rico of people from the Caribbean contacting the government officials on the island, asking for information about this individual that came on a boat, stole slaves, went to Puerto Rico. Here are their names. This is what they look like. Please stop them. Please send them back. Since the Spanish government did not have a restitution agreement with England and France. Well, France eventually they did, but especially with England, a lot of the enslaved people coming from the English colonies never made it back. They stayed in Puerto Rico as enslaved people. The island was also doing a lot of kidnapping. the kidnapping of free blacks in particular became fashionable in Puerto Rico as we got more into the 19th century. Let me wrap this up now because I see Hill. Runaway enslaved Africans also came to Puerto Rico. If you go to the island and you have an opportunity to visit San Mateo de Cangrejo, which is the town of Santurce nowadays, you will notice that there's a church there that was developed by the government of Spain to essentially indoctrinate runaway slaves that began to flee to Puerto Rico in the middle of the 17th century. And so that population, the people who did not make it to that town, who were not intercepted, they blended into the Puerto Rican population. Those that were unlucky, unfortunately, got enslaved and never made it out of slavery that way. So with that, I close. I just wanted to give you that quick summary. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this with you. And I look forward to your feedback.
Thank you so much,
Jorge.
Jorge. Alex, I leave you now. Then you go ahead to see if we have more questions and comments, and either from the panelists and those in attendance.
Okay, so we get to the juicy part. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or write them in the chat. We always prefer you to come on camera and ask your questions directly to our panelists, but if for some reason you prefer for us to read your question, we'd be happy to do so. While you cook up your questions, I'm going to ask a couple of questions for the whole team. The one is it's of course related to the fact that this book positions itself as a beginning, and in a very real sense, it is a beginning of many future possibilities of research. So what Lissette was talking about in the beginning, when she convincingly argued that this would work well in an undergraduate classroom and in a graduate classroom. One of those beginnings, of course. A lot of those beginnings, of course, are set within the text itself. So I encourage you, if you haven't read the book, to pay attention to all those questions that get posed by every one of the chapters. But some came up in the conversation here and not directly open explicitly in the text. For example, I'm thinking about the possibilities that there are for cross-Portuguese language and cross-Spanish language understandings of this period. If it is true that Santo Domingo slavery in this period is a model, it's also at the intersection of these two empires. And at least in Richard's case, in the Lopez case, we get a clear picture of the sort of Atlantic currents, as we call them, right, of communication that, for example, Edith Tone explores in her other volume, and that we covered here in the book club. So I wonder about the possibility of scholarship around that time that bridges that language gap between these two places. That's one of the questions that opens for me here. The other one I throw to all of you is this question of, I like in Lisette's chapter, how she structured the chapter as like what the archive doesn't tell us and what the archive does tell us. And I think this is great. This is a great way to structure a history chapter when we're dealing with the types of problems that we're dealing in this kind of archive. And the question to all of you is like, what are some of the possibilities that we have that open themselves up when we look at these, what it doesn't tell us and what it does tell us in the larger Atlantic world? What can we learn about Dominican slavery in what the larger Atlantic world of the 16th century doesn't tell us and tells us? That's sort of the two kind of related questions that I have to get us started while everybody cooks up their questions.
Thank you, Alex. And before I move on to attempt to answer your questions, and probably I'll combine them, I have to give a shout out to both Ana Lucia and to Anthony, because in the acknowledgements, I say that the book started in 2015 when we had a colloquium, a symposium that we put together, and that was Anthony's idea. And he said, I've been following this scholar who writes about Brazil, and I think that we have to bring her and, you know, combine this conversation about slavery and about memory. And he insisted and found Ana Lucia, and we're grateful to have her with us. And after we put this panel together, this conversation grew. And after we were done, Anna said, I think we have a book, you know, and we took it from there. So thank you both for your ideas at the beginning and for your support all of these years in expanding the project. Thank you so much. And Alex, Anthony will probably chip in, but you mentioned slavery in Santo Domingo as a model, right? But we have documents, and I included the link to the First Blacks in the Americas database that was produced also by Anthony, that contains phytographic documents and primary documents about slavery in Santo Domingo. There is one document there where the Spaniards are citing the punishments that the Portuguese are using to control the enslaved population in Brazil, and how they feel that maybe they should look to Brazil and what the Portuguese are doing in Brazil to apply that in Santo Domingo. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the document is from 1518, which is exactly when the asiento was created in Santo Domingo as the endeavor, the entrepreneurship of trafficking of Black Africans, right? Although they already had the enslaved people that they were bringing for personal use and for mining and construction and whatnot, and also sent by the Spanish crown. So even though Santo Domingo, as the port of entry for the transatlantic slave trade, there is that connection of looking to what other people were already doing. And that look was towards the Portuguese and what they were doing in Brazil. And the documents are there in that sense. To address your second question in terms of the how can we look at what the archives are telling us and not telling us, and I use the example of the story of Manuela, for example, where the document is about a page and a half long, but we know that Manuela is sold and split in 1/4. Now we need to ask ourselves, what did that mean at the time to take one person? How do you take a car and you sell it and you only sell 1/4 of the car? How many hours a day or a month do you use the car, or do you sell the whole car and split the winnings in fourth? In this case, we don't have that information about Manuela, which is why I invite, you know, people to graduate students to look into these documents and say, was this being done in other colonies? Where does this come from? How can you split in half, in fourth, in pieces, a human being and sell it? And how do you use this person, this time, their skill also, because that is something that was rented? And I think that that opens up that possibility there for more exploration, whether it is comparatively and also similarly in terms of slavery in the Americas.
That's a great example, Manuel example, because we do have a lot of historiography on the lesser than human uh, legal constructs of the 18th century and 19th century, very heavily explored in on the French side and the English side that I can tell. Anna probably knows a lot better the Portuguese side, but this is part what we have in your case, though, is the earliest example that I know of in this side of the Atlantic, of something that is well documented much later for the rest of the Atlantic, right? And this is the kind of like where when you start looking at the larger picture, how the project you're embarked on is like super important. Of course, I'll stop there because this was a question to you, not an opportunity for me to talk. Anthony, ¿tú no ibas a decir nada? No.
Yes, and you have two people, like, because you have to take to watch the time. You have 20 minutes, about 20 minutes, and we have Handy, we have Stephanie, and you also have a question in the chat. Then I
sorry,
let
sorry, Richard. Let's take Handy's question and Stephanie's question. We'll go back.
perhaps what you can do is to take two questions and then have a round of answers. Even take it Handy, Stephanie, and then also there is a question from James Louis Charles in the chat. Okay, Handy, you can go.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Perfect. First, congratulating the panel, especially Lissette, for the amazing work. Because again, I see this as a reference, the book as a reference of early Caribbean studies, especially early modern Caribbean studies, especially coming from my background that is Cuba. So I'm kind of my flavor gets like still what's going on with the eastern region of Cuba, who was connected at the time, 16th, 17th century, was deeply connected with La Española in general. We have cases of La Yaguana, people immigrating to Eastern Cuba, and we know this story, and also we have seen this reference. But what I really like, so it wasn't a question, it was like a kind of this flavor of expanding into the future, and also in my own research, I really like that you mentioned in the book two things that are uh, uh, key. One is resistance, how there is a broad spectrum of resistance. We see this reiterated, but not only just in terms of people uprising, but also creating different ways of community resistance or community mobility. Thinking in terms like creating these social networks of good parenting, and this is very important because we just have seen, or studies have focused on how good parenting was a structure, especially it's a Catholic structure, or but it was only between, or mostly focused between African slaves and free and Spanish. And what you have been seeing more and more is how actually it became later more as a network of resistance or network of mobility among African descendants, Afro descendants, free or not. I see this in Cuba as well at the time of the 17th century. This is seen in Puerto Rico as well around the same time. And the second is the economy beyond sugar plantation. This is key because it has been, I don't think that unexplored, but it's just really what the Caribbean has been known for. And focusing on gold mining, cattle ranching, uh, smuggling, and artisanal trades just give us that other story that it was actually the first couple of centuries until sugarcane was introduced, obviously early in La Española, but we have seen a kind of, you were mentioning, cycles, and what happened between those cycles. I think that this is a unexplored or needed more, and a story that needs more exploration. So these two elements, I think that it's you're opening a path. You're opening a path with the book towards focusing on personal stories that are so difficult to find in the archive. African and Afro-descendant stories are so difficult to find, and but you find it, and that's really encouraging. So there's no question, just like next time, Cuba, it's Eastern Cuba as
Thank you. Thank you, Handy. We'll take Stephanie's question. Stephanie, let's put a spotlight on you.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed doing the reading for today. I don't know if there's an answer out there, but I am curious about this issue of partial ownership, Lissette, that you brought up for Manuela, and maybe it's open to the whole group to throw in the chat. But to what extent was this commonly practiced within the Spanish Empire, but then also outside of it? Thank you.
I don't have a specific answer. And, I hint at that in the book. I wish I had more time to, and if I did, then that meant it would have been like probably another 6 more months or another year before the book came out. And in fact, it was not until the third time around of editing the book that I included Manuela. At the beginning, Manuela was not included in the chapter, and it was not until the third time around that I reread the chapter. And then I said, you know what, let me just put it out here and present this as information and possibility for someone to expand on this work, because it is a question that we should be thinking about, partial ownership. How common was this? Where was it practiced? And what were the parameters or the stipulations for someone to do that, and how did the court or even the families followed up on that? Because the way that it was done, and Alex hinted at it as well, the partial ownership of a person. We already know that they were rented out, but to sell and to explicitly say in the bill of sale, you can trade, sell, annex. What do you mean annex? How do you annex a person after you sell it? Do you mean that you can put the 1/4 back together and to another buyer? I mean, there are all of these questions about the dehumanization of Black people in this slavery process.
Thank you. And we have then some comments, questions in the chat that I hope that you can read. And there are comments, but there is James Richard. He's saying, your book highlights the transatlantic connections of the slavery in Spain, Santo Domingo, and Puerto Rico. In the US, slavery is often downplayed in the national story of democracy, while in the Dominican Republic, one still hears claims like slaves were treated like family, or that slavery only truly existed in Haiti. Across Latin America, many countries turned to blanqueamiento, promoting whiteness and minimizing Black contributions as a way to erase slavery's central role. At the same time, these white-dominated or white-passing societies are often portrayed as melting pots or colorless democracies, even though structural racism remains deeply entrenched. To what extent do you see this negation of slavery's role as a shared structural problem across the Americas, not just in the US or the Dominican Republic, but across former Spanish colonies or even in Brazil? Jorge, he brought another comment regarding loose Hispanic connections. The San Juan Cabildo repeatedly petitioned the crown to allow Portuguese labradores to settle in 16th and 17th centuries Puerto Rico. And I think that the examples from Cape Verde that Richard brought in his talk is a good example of how the Spanish slave trade and the Portuguese slave trade are then so much connected. But perhaps let's comment, then give the panelists the chance of commenting or answering the questions that we just asked.
Anthony, and by the way, I want to thank the audience because you all have been great. It's going to be almost 2 hours and almost all of you are still here. Those of you who have to leave, we completely understand. And please feel free to shoot us an email if you want to stay connected, so that we can continue the conversation, or if you have questions that you like answer in the future or would like to connect. Anthony, do you want to say something about the treatment of slaves being treated as family in the Dominican Republic, in what was Spanish Santo Domingo, or Richard, to address James's question in terms of slavery being, yes, downplayed in some places, in Latin America, you know, also including the US, and how that has contributed to this quote unquote racial democracy?
I can speak about it a bit, I guess. Unless, Anthony, do you want to go first?
You're muted.
I guess what I find, the discourse, it seems the same everywhere. There's always a discourse of slave democracy and racial democracy, and this slavery in this country was different. It's not like elsewhere. And in no case is there any truth to it. Obviously you're not going to have a situation where someone who's owned by another person, it's not going to be a cruel relationship. It's inherently cruel. I think it's based on a bad idea that, although it has a tiny bit of truth, that the experience of enslavement differed by the treatment, how owners treated you when you were enslaved. Simply being enslaved was the most horrible thing about slavery. There's brutality and hyper-exploitation across labor systems. Yes, it's going to be worse, and there's going to be more torture, et cetera, for the enslaved. But I think the greatest and most unique horror of slavery is the fact that you are the property of another person. The other person has absolute discretion over what you do. Big or small can tell you what to do. You have no freedom. So the idea that there could be any type of slavery that's not extreme horror goes against 500 years of people valorizing freedom. It doesn't make any sense, and it's ideology clouding people's instincts. I think they're terms of, but then more fully, I do find in Santo Domingo in the 18th century that the enslaved and free people of color could do things and enter and could break the legal racial hierarchy that existed in Santo Domingo. But I think it's key not to see this as the owners and white elite being more democratic or less cruel. These are concessions that they have to make in order to reduce the intent of escape. So that I think you have to flip it upside down. And this is the enslaved and free people of color insisting and having the power in some places, but not others, to secure certain spaces of greater latitude. And that greater space in Santo Domingo is the ecology, I think. And this is something that's been left out. The ecology of Santo Domingo is what distinguishes it from, say, Barbados or someplace. So the enslaved and free people of color have much more power in Santo Domingo. And that power is what allows for the quote racial democracy, not the elite being any less racist. You look at the Código Negro Carolino, nothing could be more racist, nothing could be more black and white. There's nothing more extreme racist hierarchy in the Americas, but it couldn't be imposed because they just didn't have the power to do that. A small thing, self-purchase, there's a self-purchase in relationship to partial ownership. That's very common. I've seen a lot in Cuba as well as Santo Domingo, where people can purchase a part of themselves. That's what coartación is all about, right? Where you purchase a part of yourself and keep purchasing until you've purchased all of yourself. And depending on how much of yourself you've purchased, that has implications for what you're obligated to do.
And also, I think that in terms of the treatment, Anthony, you're muted. You have to unmute your mic. I think that in terms of the treatment, there is the assumption that because it was not a sugar plantation, that in Santo Domingo, there was more haciendas and farming, that because of that, the treatment was better. Nonetheless, the laws that continue to be created all the way to El Código Negro Carolino, the Spanish Code de Nord, which was a copy of the Code de Nord from Saint-Domingue, right? They say otherwise because they are trying exactly to control the population by applying these harsh laws, which were similar to the ones that were being applied on the French colony, right? So that notion, and I think Chinea mentioned something when we spoke in December, if they were treated like family, why they couldn't open the refrigerator, for example, why they had to be branded, why have a foot cut off if they escape.
Right.
That's not how you treat family, right?
Right.
You don't usually
Lee-
own members of your family.
Lisa,
I
I know
could
you
make,
wanted to talk about the cover of the book and the painting that's behind you, but we have to wrap up sadly and announce the next meeting of the club, and we only have like 5 minutes. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Anthony, Richard, Jorge, Lissette, for joining us today. I enjoyed reading this book so much. You have no idea, and I have so much hopes for it and the work that is going to be done in the future that you open the door for here. I'm gonna ask Anna to come and send us off with an announcement about our next Slavery Book Club gathering. Anna?
Let me just find myself here, how to put myself. Okay, I am not muted. Then, so just to let you know that, remind you that this is the book that we just discussed, edited by Lissette Acosta Corniel, and you have here with us several of the contributors, Richard, Anthony, and Jose, and many others. So, Jorge, sorry. And this is Transatlantic Bondage, Slavery and Freedom in Spain, Santo Domingo, and Puerto Rico, and it was published by SUNY University Press. Then the link is going to be in this video. Then once it's going to be posted on YouTube. And I just want to let you know that we have then an entire schedule for the fall. Then if you go to www.slaveryarchive.com, we have another session in September. Actually, we have 2 sessions in September. September 13, that is a multi-volume. Then it's also about edited volumes, as the one that we had here, that is a cultural history of slavery and human trafficking. And this is 6 volumes by Bloomsbury, and that were the general editor is Africanist historian Benjamin Lawrence, and he and his editors and authors will be in the session. This is September 13, 2 p.m. Then East time. And then we have on September the 20th, also at 2 p.m., we have Julia Garfield with I Have Avenged America, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and 80s Fight for Freedom. Then you can just subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also to take a look at the schedule that is online. We have these 2 meetings in September, then 2 meetings in October, and a last meeting this fall in November. Thank you so much to all of you who attended, and Lissette, Richard, Anthony, and Jorge, and all the others who came to attend with us today.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Saludos. Bye-bye. Mucho gusto.
Gracias.
Anna, can you stay for a second? Thank you,
Yes,
everybody.
yes. Thank you.